The cameras were rolling, but the most powerful man in the country was terrified. He was not afraid of a foreign army or a wealthy political rival. He was afraid of a middle-aged woman sitting quietly before a microphone, wearing a simple dress and carrying the invisible scars of a Mississippi jail cell. When she finally opened her mouth to speak, the President of the United States hastily called an emergency press conference. His goal was simple. He needed to cut the national television feed. He needed to silence her before the rest of the country heard the undeniable reality of what she had survived. But the truth has a way of cutting through the static. This was not a trained politician or a polished speaker. She was a quiet reckoning. She carried the weight of hard truths that a deeply divided nation had spent decades trying to bury in the dirt of cotton fields. Her voice, heavy with sorrow yet completely unbroken, spoke for millions who had been rendered invisible. What happens when a person who has been stripped of everything decides they have nothing left to lose? How does a single, unvarnished testimony force an entire nation to look in the mirror and ask itself a devastating question? Is this America? The Mississippi sun did not warm the skin. It punished it. In Montgomery County, the air was thick with humidity and the silence of people who were forced to labor for a dream they could never own. This was the world she was born into in 1917. She was the 20th child of sharecroppers, brought into a system designed to keep her family tied to the dirt forever. There was no childhood in the cotton fields. There was only the quota. At 6 years old, she was given a sack and told to walk the rows. The rough canvas dragged against the earth, growing heavier with every white boll she plucked from the sharp stems. By the time she was 13, she was picking hundreds of pounds of cotton a day. Her hands were calloused, her back was constantly bent, and her education was cut short. The schools for black children were only open a few months a year, just long enough to learn basic numbers so they could count the cotton they gathered for white landowners. Her parents tried to break the cycle. They worked relentlessly, saving every penny they could hide away. Eventually, they managed to buy 3 mules, a few cows, and a wagon. For a brief moment, it looked like they might claw their way to a small piece of independence. But independence was a dangerous thing for a black family in the Jim Crow South. A local white neighbor, threatened by their modest progress, poisoned their mules. The animals died, and with them, the family's fragile hope. They plunged back into a cycle of inescapable debt. It was a silent, devastating lesson taught to a young girl. Hard work and honesty were not enough to buy freedom in a land that hated your progress. She grew older, married a man named Perry, and settled into the quiet, restricted life of a timekeeper on a large plantation. For a long time, she tried to exist within the narrow boundaries set for her. She kept her head down. She went to church. She tried to build a quiet life in a loud, violent world. But the system would not let her rest. The cruelty of the era was not always a burning cross or a mob. Sometimes it wore a white coat and operated in a sterile hospital room. In 1961, she went to a local hospital to have a small uterine tumor removed. She trusted the doctor. She trusted the quiet routine of a medical procedure. When she woke up, the pain was different. It was deep, empty, and absolute. Without her consent, without her knowledge, the white doctor had performed a complete hysterectomy. He took away her ability to ever have children. It was a practice so common among black women in the South that it had a grim, casual nickname. They called it a Mississippi appendectomy. It was a deliberate, state-sanctioned erasure of black motherhood. A doctor had simply looked at her sleeping body and decided she did not have the right to build a family. The anger did not come in a scream. It settled into her bones like lead. The physical violation was horrific, but the psychological betrayal was a turning point. She realized that playing by their rules would not protect her. Keeping her head down would not save her body or her dignity. In the late summer of 1962, a small group of civil rights workers came to her small town of Rollville. They held a meeting at a local church. They did not bring weapons or money. They brought a radical idea. They talked about the United States Constitution. They talked about the right to vote. She sat in the wooden pews and listened. For the first time, she heard that the law actually said she was a citizen. She heard that her suffering was not a natural law, but a man-made cage. When the organizers asked who would go down to the county courthouse to register to vote, the room went completely still. Everyone knew the cost. People lost their jobs, their homes, and their lives for walking up those courthouse steps. But a woman who has had everything taken from her no longer fears the thief. She raised her hand. Fannie Lou Hamer stood up from the pew, and in that quiet movement, the course of American history began to shift. The price of her courage was exacted immediately. When she returned to the plantation after attempting to register to vote, the landowner was waiting. He delivered a simple ultimatum: go back to the courthouse and withdraw the registration, or pack her bags and leave the land she had worked for almost 2 decades. She looked at the man who controlled her livelihood and gave an answer that sealed her fate. She told him she did not go down there to register for him. She went down there to register for herself. She was forced to leave that very night. Her husband was required to stay behind until the harvest was finished. She had no job, no home, and an undeniable target on her back. A few nights later, night riders fired 16 bullets into the house where she was seeking shelter. They wanted to send a message. They wanted her dead. But intimidation only works on those who still have something they are afraid to lose. Instead of retreating into the shadows, Fannie Lou Hamer stepped directly into the fire. She became a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Her job was to travel through the most dangerous counties in the Deep South, convincing black citizens to do the very thing that had cost her everything. She walked up to crumbling porches. She stood in small, overheated churches. She spoke to people who had been terrorized into silence for generations. She did not use academic theories or complex political jargon. She spoke of their shared reality. She spoke of the empty cupboards and the calloused hands. She told them that a system built on their fear could only be dismantled by their courage. And when the fear became too much, she used her most powerful weapon, her voice. When police stopped their buses on dark country roads, heavily armed and looking for a reason to unleash violence, the silence inside the cabin would become suffocating. In those terrifying moments, a deep, resonant voice would rise from the back. She would start to sing. She sang hymns like "This Little Light of Mine" and "Go Tell on the Mountain." The melodies were old, but the purpose was entirely new. The music wrapped around the terrified activists like a shield. It steadied trembling hands. It reminded the men with the guns that the people on the bus were human beings, grounded in a faith that bullets could not touch. She soon realized that simply registering voters was not enough. The entire political machine was built to exclude them. The official Democratic Party in Mississippi did not allow black citizens to participate in its meetings or its decisions. It was a closed door. If they could not walk through the front door, they decided to build their own house. She became a driving force behind the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It was a staggering act of political defiance. Tens of thousands of disenfranchised citizens held their own meetings, cast their own mock ballots, and elected their own delegates. They operated a shadow democracy in a state that denied them basic citizenship. They were no longer asking for permission to participate. They were organizing to demand their rightful place on the national stage. They set their sights on the upcoming national convention. They were going to force the country to look at the blood on the hands of its political institutions. The violence they promised finally caught up to her in June of 1963. She was returning from a voter registration workshop in South Carolina. The bus pulled into a terminal in Winona, Mississippi. A few of her companions stepped off to use the restroom and grab a bite to eat at the lunch counter. They were instantly arrested. The crime was simply existing in a space reserved for white citizens. When she stepped off the bus to see what was happening to her friends, the police grabbed her too. They did not just arrest her. They dragged her into the dark, hidden machinery of Southern justice. They threw her into a cell. What happened inside the Winona jail was not just a beating. It was a calculated destruction of human dignity. A state highway patrolman walked into her cell. He did not raise his own hand. Instead, he brought in 2 black prisoners. He handed them a heavy, leather-bound blackjack. He gave them a simple, terrifying order. They were to beat her. If they refused, They would be beaten or killed themselves. This was the architecture of the Jim Crow South. It was a system designed to force the oppressed to tear each other apart for the amusement of their captors. She was forced to lie face down on a cot. The first prisoner began to strike her. He hit her with everything he had until he was completely exhausted. Then, the patrolman ordered the second prisoner to take the blackjack and continue the assault. The pain was blinding. Her skin turned black and blue. As the blows rained down, she instinctively reached down to pull her dress over her exposed legs, trying to preserve some small piece of modesty. A white officer stepped forward and pulled her dress back up. They beat her until her body went completely numb. They left her on the cold floor, bleeding and broken. The physical damage was permanent. Her kidneys were severely injured. A blood clot formed behind her left eye, leaving her with a lifelong loss of vision. She would walk with a heavy limp for the rest of her days. The men who ordered the beating expected her to crawl back to the cotton fields and remain silent. They broke her body. They assumed they had broken her spirit. They were wrong. Exactly 1 year later, in August of 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer walked into the Credentials Committee room at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. She was there to represent the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was there to challenge the all-white delegation that claimed to speak for her state. The room was packed with seasoned politicians, sharp-suited lawyers, and national journalists. She sat down at the witness table. She wore a simple dress and carried a small purse. She looked directly into the television cameras. She did not scream. She did not cry. She spoke with the calm, terrifying clarity of someone who has survived the worst the world has to offer. She introduced herself. She gave her name and her address in Ruleville, Mississippi. And then she told them about Winona. She described the jail cell. She described the blackjack. She described the sound of the leather hitting her flesh. She described the 2 black prisoners forced to do the devil's work. The politicians in the room sat in stunned silence. This was not a policy debate. This was a crime scene being detailed on national television. Then, Fannie Lou Hamer leaned forward. The weight of centuries of suffering was in her voice. She looked at the committee, and, through the cameras, she looked directly into the living rooms of millions of white Americans. She asked a question that stopped the political machine in its tracks. "Is this America?" she asked. "The land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America." It was the ultimate confrontation. The truth was out. The bleeding wounds of the South were suddenly visible on every television screen in the country. There was no more hiding. The President of the United States thought he had one. Lyndon B. Johnson had successfully diverted the live television broadcast. He called a sudden press conference to talk about an anniversary of a minor event. His strategy was purely political. He needed the support of the white Southern delegates to win the upcoming election. He could not afford to let a black woman from Mississippi tear his fragile coalition apart on national television. When a live feed cut away from the Credentials Committee room, the political bosses breathed a sigh of relief. They believed they had silenced the storm. They fundamentally misunderstood the power of what had just happened. You can cut a camera feed, but you cannot erase a heavy truth once it enters the room. The evening news anchors had seen the testimony. The journalists in the room had heard the breaking of her voice. When the major networks aired their primetime broadcast that night, they did not show the president's manufactured press conference. They showed the tapes. They broadcast the full, uninterrupted testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer to an even larger audience. Millions of Americans were sitting down for dinner. They were in comfortable living rooms in New York, in quiet suburbs in Ohio, and in farmhouses in the Midwest. They turned on their televisions, expecting the usual political theater. Instead, they were confronted with a mirror. They looked at the screen and saw a woman who looked like their neighbor or their church choir director or their aunt. They saw the deep sadness in her eyes. They heard the horrific details of the blackjack and the jail cell floor. The brutality of the Jim Crow South was no longer an abstract concept or a distant rumor. It was sitting right in their homes. Thousands of miles away from the cotton fields of Ruleville, it hit close to home. The silence in those living rooms was louder than any political debate. The switchboards at the White House and the Democratic headquarters lit up. The phones rang endlessly. Ordinary citizens were weeping on the other end of the line. They were outraged. They demanded to know how their country could allow such absolute terror to exist under the protection of the law. The moral high ground shifted overnight. The impact reached far beyond American borders. International newspapers picked up the story. The world watched as the self-proclaimed leader of the free world was exposed by one of its most vulnerable citizens. Cold War adversaries used the footage to point out the glaring hypocrisy of American democracy. How could a nation preach freedom to the globe while its own citizens were beaten in secret jail cells for trying to vote? The global embarrassment became a critical lever. The United States government realized that the continued subjugation of Black Americans was a massive vulnerability on the world stage. Back in Atlantic City, the political machine tried to offer a compromise. They offered the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party 2 symbolic seats at the convention. They expected the sharecroppers to be grateful for the crumbs. Fannie Lou Hamer looked at the polished men offering the deal. She rejected it without hesitation. She told them her people did not come all this way for 2 seats when all of them were tired. She understood that accepting a token gesture was a betrayal of the blood spilled in Winona. They walked away from the convention floor. They lost the political maneuver, but they completely dismantled the moral authority of the establishment. The fallout from that August day could not be contained. The country had been forced to witness its own cruelty. The pressure continued to build in the streets, in the churches, and in the halls of Congress. Less than a year later, the president who had tried to silence her was forced to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The legislation outlawed the literacy tests. It dismantled the legal barriers that had kept Black citizens from the ballot box. It was one of the most significant pieces of civil rights legislation in the history of the nation. It was signed with expensive pens by men in dark suits. But the foundation of that law was not built in Washington. It was built on the bruised back of a woman who refused to stay down. It was forged in the quiet dignity of Fannie Lou Hamer, who looked directly into the soul of a fractured nation and demanded that it finally tell the truth. She did not live to see the full harvest of the seed she planted. In 1977, her body finally gave out. She was 59 years old. The deep poverty she was born into, the quiet battle with breast cancer, and the permanent physical damage inflicted on the cold floor of that Mississippi jail cell took their final toll. She died in the same dusty town where she had once picked cotton under the punishing sun. She did not leave behind a financial fortune. She did not leave behind a political dynasty. But what Fannie Lou Hamer left behind was a profound blueprint for human courage. Her tombstone carries a simple, heavy phrase she made famous. She was sick and tired of being sick and tired. She proved that real power does not only reside in marble buildings, closed boardrooms, or expensive suits. Power resides in the absolute refusal to accept a lie. Power is a scarred woman looking directly at the architects of her oppression and asking them to justify their cruelty to the world. Some stories end without perfect closure, but dignity doesn't need applause. The political machine never truly apologized for the years they spent trying to erase her. The men who orchestrated her beatings were never fully brought to justice in a Southern courtroom. Yet, she walked through her final years with a quiet strength that no system could ever break. She found her freedom within herself, long before the laws of the land ever recognized it. Fannie Lou Hamer spoke a heavy truth that America was not ready to hear. But because she spoke it anyway, the foundation of the nation was permanently altered. She held up a mirror, and the reflection could not be unseen. To anyone who's ever stood alone, we see you. Maybe you've been in a moment like this, not facing down a national political empire or surviving a jail cell, but facing betrayal, isolation, or a system that tried to make you feel completely invisible. Maybe you had to speak a hard truth when your voice was shaking and the room was entirely against you. If the unyielding spirit of Fannie Lou Hamer reminds you of someone who fought quietly for their own dignity, or if it reminds you of your own silent battles, share it below. Write their name. Tell your story. We read every comment. Do not let the silence win. Subscribe to our channel to join a community that remembers the quiet courage shaping our world. Until next time, hold on to your truth.